Hello and welcome. I am Lian Buan, and this is Rappler Talk. Why is former Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte charged of only 43 killings in the case of crimes against humanity of murder in a world where there were at least 7,000 killings by the police in his campaign against drugs? Human rights groups estimate it could have at least reached 30,000. There's been a lot of discussion and disinformation about what crimes against humanity really is. And for this episode, we have invited an expert. Professor Leila Sadat is a professor at the Washington University School of Law, and she's also the chair of its Crimes Against Humanity initiative. Joining us from St. Louis in the United States, thank you very much, Professor Leila Sadat, for this time.
Thank you so much.
I'll get right into it. So the discussion right now is the crimes against humanity, as I've been told, does not have a number threshold, but that it investigates a policy or a system of killing. So what people are asking, if you have to establish a policy of killing, how would you then say that these killings were part of that policy if there's no amount of or a number of killings?
Thank you so much. So crimes against humanity, and I should say I also served as a special advisor to the International Criminal Court prosecutor on crimes against humanity for 10 years, but I'm no longer with the office and speaking in my personal capacity. So the way that the prosecutor will establish a crime against humanity is to show that there was a widespread or systematic attack against a civilian population consisting of a number of acts that are set out in Article 7 of the Rome Statute, and that the attack is conducted pursuant to a state or organizational policy. And that, of course, is where you started your inquiry. Now, the policy need not be formal. It need not be in writing, and it can be established by evidence showing that there was a pattern, that the killings had a certain that a pattern was repeated, if you like, that there was a certain modus operandi that accompanied all the killings. Obviously, the prosecutor will look for evidence of absolute direction or intent, but that's not necessary under the ICC elements of crimes. So the policy element is different than the systematicity element. And really the objective there is just to show that the killings were not random. Given the fact that the estimates of the killings in the Philippines are so high, we've seen them anywhere from 8 to 30,000 individuals, it's very unlikely that the policy element would be much of a hurdle to the prosecutor in this particular case.
As it stands, the first case set of the prosecutor, a non-exhaustive list, they say, is 43 killings. What is the legal framework to establish that there was a nexus between the acts, the 43, and the system?
Interesting. So the killings you're going to have to show were taking place pursuant to the state or organizational policy, that the accused had an awareness of the policy. And I think that's not going to be difficult to show, again, in the particular instance. And one of the things with the former president that's true is that the same pattern of killings had emerged when he was the mayor of another city in the Philippines. So in other words, this isn't the first time we've seen a pattern of killings under his leadership. That said, obviously the prosecutor has to fully prove all the elements of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt, not at the confirmation stage. So the hearing in September is a lower threshold of evidence than for conviction. But it is substantial, right? I didn't mean to interrupt you. You know, cases do fall apart at the confirmation stage, and various challenges can be raised by the accused, as well as putting the prosecutor to its evidence.
You earlier said it's not going to be difficult to hurdle the systematicity of the killing. Why do you say that?
So at least from the publicly available information, I can't speak to anything that's confidential, obviously, but the publicly available information on the killings in the Philippines shows a very distinctive pattern in terms of when they took place, against whom they took place, what it looked like when the killings were happening, that the state denied responsibility for the killings. And so this is a pattern we have seen in other countries where extrajudicial executions or killings by the state, but using non-state actors happens. Sometimes it's state officials that are being used, sometimes it's non-state actors. And given the extensive documentation of the killings by human rights organizations, by victims' families, we've seen a lot of video footage, actually. I think it won't be particularly difficult to show that, at least at the confirmation stage. It's quite different when you get to trial, where you have to establish every element beyond a reasonable doubt. And there, of course, the defense is completely within its rights to contest either the veracity of video footage or to cross-examine any witnesses that testify that they saw what happened. So obviously, once you get to the trial phase, it's a much more difficult standard. At the confirmation stage, I'm fairly confident, given what I've seen even in the public domain, that the prosecutor ought to be successfully able to confirm these charges.
The former president has a knack of being proud or even boasting of his policy to kill. He would always say, shoot them dead, kill. Will that be a crucial element to the case?
Well, it certainly is what a prosecutor dreams of getting. Often you don't get an accused that actually admits that they're going to commit a crime. Now, sometimes, even when you have language that clear, the accused on the stand will say, well, I didn't really mean that, or that wasn't really my intent. That was just a manner of speaking. I suspect his defense lawyers will try to walk back from some of those statements. But again, this is a pretty clear pattern with the former president, exhibited not just during his presidency, but in his time as mayor. And I think he has, in a way, convicted himself in his own words.
Well, he is charged of being an indirect co-perpetrator, so our logic tells us there are others. How soon do you think the warrants would be out for the other co-perpetrators?
I can't speak to that. And the indirect co-perpetrator language is just a strange locution that they use at the ICC, wherever they're indicting the top person in the chain. Unusually, in the English language, they call that person the indirect co-perpetrator because essentially they're the individual at the top of the apex that is controlling the crime through their subordinates, right? So indirect co-perpetration. So Article 25(3)(a) has sort of it has sort of three possibilities. One is that the person committed the crime. The other, that the person committed the crime jointly with another. So that's joint, right? They're co-perpetrators. That's direct co-perpetration. Indirect co-perpetration is when they committed the crime through another person. And we use that for top-ranking officials, even though it's a very strange locution in the English language. We use it because the top person isn't usually the person pulling the trigger. They're not the ones on the street identifying the people, pulling them into the truck, killing them. They're working through other people. And so that's what Muammar Gaddafi was charged with. That's how the ICC frames its charging practice with respect to top-ranked officials who are committing crimes through other people. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense. Thank you, Professor. This is a line of defense by the Duterte government that I hear often is because they will say, we're not in a state of war. We're not a broken system. There's no armed conflict. What it is a campaign against drugs. It's a public order policy. Have you seen other cases where it was not an armed conflict? It's just a public order safety policy.
Well, let me separate that into two different categories. So crimes against humanity can occur outside of armed conflict. And many situations at the ICC are what we call peacetime situations. The Venezuela situation, the Afghanistan situation right now, the Philippines situation. So the fact that there's no war is not really relevant to whether crimes against humanity are being committed. Now, the defense, obviously, of the government is either that they were fighting terrorism or they were fighting criminal activity. States have a duty, in fact, to protect their citizens from criminal activity. However, they also have a duty not to extrajudicially execute individuals without due process. And so the flaw in, at least as the facts are stated, right, and this will all be proved at trial, but at least as the facts are stated, the problem here isn't that the government's trying to stop criminal activity in the Philippines. that's a good thing, right? It's the method that they're using to do it, which is massive extrajudicial execution without trial. And that can be a crime against humanity if it's widespread or systematic, which the prosecutor believes, and I think the public record shows it was in this particular case.
As you said, the September 23 hearing is of a much lower threshold. The higher threshold will be beyond that. It seems to me that the first big hurdle of the prosecution would be jurisdiction. And there's been a lot of discussion of whether the Philippines is still under the jurisdiction because the investigation was authorized way after we have withdrawn, or the withdrawal has been made effective. What is your opinion on this issue?
So my opinion is that the chambers are getting it right, and we have a certain degree of ambiguity in the Rome Statute. Article 127 of the statute states that as long as there are proceedings sort of under consideration, the jurisdiction of the court remains attached. And so really the question here is, was the preliminary examination that started sufficient to keep the court's jurisdiction alive? Now, some judges in dissent looked at Article 12 of the statute and they said, well, but you have to actually be exercising your jurisdiction, and the preliminary examination phase isn't enough. And so under international law, we look at a treaty called the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, and we say, okay, we have some ambiguity in the Rome Statute. How do we resolve this? We look at the text, we look at the context, we look at the object and purpose, and then we look at the Vienna Convention. We look at other sources of international law and the practice of other international courts. And uniformly, in all cases, the International Court of Justice, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and the ICC have concluded that unless there's a specific statutory bar, the rule is the court's jurisdiction remains attached so long as, in the ICC case, there were some proceedings that were opened and that the crimes were committed while the state was still a party to the Rome Statute. And both conditions are met in the Philippines case, and that's why they say there is continuing jurisdiction in the case. Obviously, that will be litigated, right?
Yeah.
But I think the courts have been getting it right.
I understand it's because like we were only the second party to withdraw from the ICC, and in Burundi's case, the chamber authorized the investigation within the withdrawal period. Are we novel in that sense? Is this why this is still an issue to this day? It's because it's the first time that this happened?
Well, I think, you can imagine a continuum situation, right? So you can't, absolutely, it would be impossible, I think, now to hold the Philippines under jurisdiction of the court for crimes that were committed after the withdrawal. Clearly, there's no jurisdiction, or even for crimes that were committed a long time ago that were not under preliminary examination. Clearly, there has to be some activity by the court in order to trigger the court's jurisdiction and make the withdrawal ineffective. It's true that Burundi is in a later stage. So Burundi, if you think of a continuum, right, the Philippines is probably at the beginning of the continuum. Burundi is probably well within the statutory situation. And the example I gave of, well, the crimes were committed before, but nothing was done, right? The referral Article 15 communication happens today. Those crimes are clearly outside the window. So you have what I would say is a continuum. And I think this is within the continuum because the crimes were committed while the statute was in force, and the preliminary examination shows that they were under consideration by the court.
Professor, just on complementarity, because we've just learned that our Department of Justice has actually been preparing a local complaint for our international humanitarian law, our domestic law. If they indeed pursue that, would that take away the jurisdiction of the ICC because of complementarity?
So the rule at the ICC is same person and same conduct. And in the Al-Sanusi case, in the Libya case, the court did find it had no jurisdiction because Libya was actually pursuing Mr. Al-Sanusi for the same conduct that he was being pursued for at the ICC. So absolutely, the Philippines, unless it's not genuine, that's some wiggle room in the statutory language, but the Philippines absolutely does have the right to take the case from the ICC if the Philippines wants to move forward. And in fact, we have precedent for that actually happening at the court. Yeah.
Just last two questions. During the initial appearance, Mr. Duterte's lawyer said, the ICC is desperate for a prize catch, desperate for a legal show, and it's not an uncommon criticism toward the ICC. What is your view on this?
I think the ICC is criticized no matter what it does. If it issues arrest warrants, then there's a huge hullabaloo about this is unfair, these people are being targeted, the ICC is desperate. If it doesn't issue arrest warrants, it's a waste of time, it's inefficient. I think the ICC, first of all, it's not an animate object, it's not a thing. The prosecutor actually received a referral, the prosecutor began a preliminary examination. It's a very judicial process. Does that make sense? The arrest warrant has to be confirmed by a pretrial chamber. The arrest warrant is then sent to a state for implementation because the ICC doesn't have its own police force. It's not uncommon for criminal defendants to attack the court that's indicting them. But I think in this case, it's really misplaced, especially given the extensive victimization in the Philippines. We have documented killings of thousands of individuals, and they deserve justice, whether it's in the Philippines or at the ICC. They certainly deserve a day in court.
All right, this is the last note. Your Nuremberg lecture, you said we need a global treaty on crimes against humanity. Can you help us explain why that would be important?
Yes. So right now, it's one of the three pieces of international criminal law that's missing. And without a global treaty, for example, you can't go to the International Court of Justice in situations. There's no possibility for state responsibility, and there's no duty on states to prevent crimes against humanity. The best thing is to build good citizenship amongst states. Of course, we want states to be sovereign. We want states to take the lead. We're not trying to take away anybody's sovereignty. And the idea is that states should be the first to prevent and punish these crimes. And unless you have the ability to engage in mutual legal assistance, to engage in support, to have an enforcement mechanism in the national systems and ways of cooperating, states just can't do that right now. It's not sufficient to have the crime and customary international law, and there are many non-ICC states parties that are not linked into the Rome Statute system. So the other thing is to pull those states in. They are parties to the Genocide Convention, they're parties to the Geneva Conventions, but they haven't yet joined the Rome Statute. And so I think it's also for those states kind of a way station, right? It's a way for them to be comfortable doing this in their own national systems before maybe they sign on to an international court. So it's a critical piece of the infrastructure. Philippines was very supportive during the negotiations. And I think also we will see some new crimes added to the statute, gently, small changes that will respond to the needs of the 21st century. So we're very hopeful.
Yeah, here's to hoping the Philippines could remain an active supporter to that effort. Thank you so much, Professor Leila Sadat.